I'm going to call it to order. This is the Construction Advisory and Appeals Board. This is May 9th, 11 a.m. I'd like to welcome everybody for coming, or thank everybody for coming and welcome y'all to the meeting. Before we get started on our first agenda item, I know we have a couple of speaker cards here. We'd like to go ahead and move item B, the public comment, on up to the front of the agenda, and then we'll get into the actual action item that we're here to discuss. First one is going to be Ken Carter. Oh. Yep, that's not on the agenda. Yeah, let's go ahead and review the minutes from the January 10th meeting and approve those before we get started on the public comment. Thanks, Doug.
I make the motion that we approve the minutes from the last meeting.
Can I get a second?
Second.
All right, got a first by Doug, a second by Nico. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. All right, so now let's go ahead and move the public comment up to the front. The first one I have is going to be Ken Carter. If you'd like to...
Especially if I could talk after the presentation of what's going to be presented, so I'll know more about what he's wanting to do. It would make maybe a little more sense. I don't mind talking now, but...
Okay. Then do we want to move the public comment between presentation and staff comment?
That's certainly at your discretion.
Okay, let's do that. Let's move the public comment between Mr. Tucker's discussion and staff comment. So next thing on the agenda is consider a request made by James E. Tucker for his existing apartment complex, the Fairways, located at 3623 McCann Rd. Mr. Tucker has filed an appeal of the Fire Code officials' interpretation of how the 2012 International Fire Code should be applied to his existing apartment complex in regards to portable fire extinguishers. Mr. Tucker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, gentlemen of the board. Appreciate this opportunity to make this presentation, and I'm hoping I'm not going to drop all my notes all over everything. Stay. My wife and I own the Fairways Apartments, which is on the corner of McCann and Hawkins Parkway. I'm sure you know where it is. On January 29th, 2018, we received a fire department violation notice, which stated that we must add an extinguisher to every downstairs set of 2 apartments. It's my position that this requirement is a clear violation of Section 102.1.1 of the IFC. If you'll allow me to give a little bit of background. After receiving this violation, I wrote a letter to Fire Chief J.P. Steelman. I asked for a copy of the change in fire regulations that applied retroactively to apartment complexes. I also stated that in 35 years of owning apartment complexes all over the southeastern United States, I had always been grandfathered in when new regulations were passed. Mr. Kevin May replied to my letter. He did not include a copy of any regulations, any new regulations that applied retroactively to the Fairways. Instead, he quoted from Section 906 of the IFC and included a formal interpretation from the NFPA regarding portable fire extinguishers from the 2010 edition of the NFPA. In the last paragraph of his letter, Mr. May stated, quote, "Once something is found to not be in compliance, the IFC does not excuse it from meeting the standards," unquote. That was my first clue that the fire department was creatively interpreting the IFC. Mr. May intentionally skipped Section 102 of the code to focus on Section 906 in order to justify the violation. Now, having mentioned Section 102 of the code, the packet that was given to you, I guess, by the city has a copy of that on the, I guess what, 5th, 6th page? Chapter 1, Scope and Administration, if you'll look at that, please. Section 102 of the code, titled Applicability, A, 102.1, Construction and Design Provisions. The construction and design provisions of this code shall apply to 1, structures, facilities, and conditions arising after the adoption of this code. Number 2, existing structures, facilities, and conditions not legally in existence at the time of the adoption of the code. Number 3, existing structures, facilities, and conditions where, when required in Chapter 11. And number 4, existing structures, facilities, and conditions which, in the opinion of the fire code official, constitute a distinct hazard to life and property. Mr. May omitted Section 102 for a reason. In my opinion, Section 102.1 clearly states that the code does not apply to existing buildings at the time the code is adopted. Now, Mr. Savasta and Mr. May and Mr. Hall have all pointed out to me number 4 under that heading, that in the opinion of the fire code official, anything they want to do, they can make me do it. Well, doesn't read that way, does it? There's one word there that matters, the word distinct. If they come to my property and they see a distinct, a singular, a specific violation, a threat to life or property, they do have the right to make me do that. They do not have the right to make me conform to 2012 or any later code. My property was finished in 1980. It must have conformed to the code at the time. It was approved. Certificates of occupancy were given. It has been inspected 30, 35 times since then. I'll gladly provide a copy of the 2017 inspection. No violation. But with this new creative interpretation of Section 102.1.4, the fire code officials and the building code officials have taken unto themselves power that the code does not convey. If you think about it for just a minute, if the authors of the code wanted the fire department and the building code department officials to do anything they wanted to do, they would have said it. If they wanted it to apply to existing buildings and new buildings, they would have said it. They could have left 102.1 out entirely. They didn't. It's in there for a reason, and in my opinion, that reason is to limit the power of the building code and fire code officials to damage the value of existing properties by forcing them to comply with current code. Had a meeting with Mr. Savasta, Mr. May, Mr. Hall, and a number of other people on March 20th to discuss this, and I brought up Section 102.1.1. And their immediate response was, oh, look at number 4. We can do anything we want. Mr. Savasta was very blunt during our meeting. He told me that he could force me to do whatever he wanted me to do. According to number 4, I had to do what he said. And if it wasn't in the code, he would get the city council to pass an ordinance, and then it would be law. And that's not the way it's supposed to work. He also told me that the fire extinguishers were just the first step, that they were then moving on to the violations for height of railings, spacings of spindles, and they would really like for all of us old apartment complexes to put in sprinklers. And I left that meeting knowing I was going to have to fight to preserve my right of grandfathering, and I hired Ms. Silcox. On the 16th of last month, the City of Longview held a code seminar for the Greater Longview Area Apartment Association. And during his presentation on building codes, I asked Mr. Hall the following question, quote, "Are you telling me clearly that the City of Longview is going to enforce current code on older properties?" Unquote. His response, quote, "I am," unquote. And if you want to listen to the recording, I'll let you listen to it. And that brings us to this hearing. Gentlemen, I have owned condominium projects, townhouse projects, and apartment projects for the past 35 years in 6 southeastern states. I've done projects from Palm Beach, Florida, to Memphis, Tennessee, and Charlotte, to Atlanta, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and little Luverne, Alabama. And in none of those states, over 30 years plus, none of them have I been required to bring a property up to current code unless my renovations or rebuild exceeded 50% of the value of the property. Now that's important because that's in the code and everybody understands it, including the insurance companies, because the insurance companies sell me something called law and ordinance coverage. It's an add-on to my commercial property coverage. And what it says basically is that if I have a building burned down and I am required to bring it up to code and my coverage under that commercial policy is not enough, then the law and ordinance coverage kicks in and they pay the difference to bring it up to code. Gentlemen, that risk, the risk of rebuilding a damaged property up to code, is understood by every investor who buys a property. And that's why we buy law and ordinance coverage. This risk, the risk that Mr. Zavasta, Mr. Hall, and Mr. May are putting on us, is not understood and not accepted by every investor of an existing building. We believe we're grandfathered in, and in most places in the world we are. Let's get past the interpretation of the code. I think I'm right, they think they're right. Let's talk about the financial ramifications. If I have to put in those fire extinguishers, there is a short-term and a long-term cost. The short-term cost, of course, is the cost of buying the extinguishers and the boxes and mounting them on my building, maybe $2,500, $3,000. The long-term cost is that now I'm going to have those fire extinguishers inspected and replenished or repaired or whatever every single year. And over the past 2 years, on our existing fire extinguishers, which is about 38, 39 of them, we've spent roughly $360 per year getting them fixed. And the first thing that goes through your mind is, so what? 360 bucks, no big deal. Well, it does matter. You're all aware that the cash flow from a property such as mine determines its value. And what they're going to do is they're going to add $360 in expense to my bottom line. And that lowers my cash flow. And at a 7 cap rate, that's $5,100 bucks. Again, to the city, that's nothing. But you multiply it times all those apartment complexes out there, they want to make us do this. It's going to be a lot of money. Also, if it becomes public knowledge that the city wants all of existing buildings, and I'm going to assume it's all existing buildings, not just apartment complexes, to meet code, what's that going to do to the sales price? Right now, Town Oaks, north and south, is for sale. Apartment complex on Eastman Road. The buyer of that property, I promise you, whoever's looking at that property is assuming they're grandfathered in. But if the seller discloses to them that they're going to have to bring that property up to current code, as Mr. Hall said, what do you think this buyer is going to do? The seller will ask, the buyer will ask the seller to take a discount to pay for whatever that's going to be. And I think that's justified on the buyer's behalf. And if they are going to go as far as forcing us to put in sprinklers, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. And those owners are not going to take that hit freely. And I don't think they should. All of this is because Mr. Savasta, Mr. Hall, and Mr. May choose to misinterpret the clear meaning of the code. They cannot grant themselves this power. Their power is restricted in the code. Let me point out something else. If you take a look at section 102 again, specifically number 3, it mentions chapter 11. Read those 4 carefully and tell me if you see chapter 9. Not there. They're relying entirely on chapter 9. In my opinion, we are either grandfathered in or they can hold us to chapter 11 I have been notified of no violations for anything under Chapter 11, but a violation under Chapter 9. Either the code means what it says or the code does not. What I'm asking for this board to do is to direct the city building officials and the fire code officials to adhere to the codes as written and not to try to enforce their flawed interpretation of the code on existing buildings. On behalf of all owners of existing properties in Longview, I ask you to memorialize the fact that we are grandfathered in and that the current code cannot be retroactively applied to our properties. And let me close with this. Mr. Hall has said on a number of occasions that grandfathered in does not exist. So let me read something for you. And I apologize, I should have pulled this out at the beginning. I'm sorry. Article 4, Enforcement, Section 85-80, Non-Conforming Signs. Any sign which existed at the time of adoption of this chapter that was legally erected prior to enactment of this chapter but fails to conform to the provisions specified herein shall be regarded as a non-conforming sign which may remain in place. Such signs need not be reconstructed, but must be kept in good repair and maintained in a safe condition. Mr. Hall, Mr. Zavastin, Mr. May can say that grandfathered in doesn't exist. This is your sign ordinance. It's in your sign ordinance. Thank you, gentlemen.
Sorry, I didn't know if you had to officially call my name for the record. My name is Christina Silcox. I'm an attorney. I represent Mr. Tucker. We had a discussion. I can divulge this, that I said, Mr. Tucker, you know this just as well, if not better than me. You know your property. You know what's going on in Longview, Texas. He takes very good care of this property. He didn't even mention the condition of the property. He's got tenants that are willing and able to stay there for their lifetime. It is upkept. As you heard, there have been no violations, no fire code violations that he's aware of even before he purchased this property, which I believe was about 5 or 6 years ago. It's an excellent run property. He cares about his tenants. He cares about the property. He cares about his employees. His concern here is that the city is overstepping their boundaries, and they're going to continue to do so, and he's going to have to expend a lot of money, and not just him, other apartment complexes, other buildings in the city of Longview. This may seem like just a little issue, fire extinguishers, but as I said, it's been expressed to him that they're not stopping there. We still do think the interpretation of the code that the fire officials now are applying is incorrect. Of the last 38 years, the fire marshal at the time, whoever inspected this property, did not agree with that interpretation and did not enforce it as they are currently. They did not say you need to install fire extinguishers on the first floor. And for the legalities of it, we did file requesting a variance exception to the, in addition to saying that they're not applying it correctly, to give you the ability to allow Mr. Tucker to continue operating as he has been for the last 38 years and as the fire code officials have determined to the extent that they've inspected his property. When you look at the actual distance, it's the requirement, and you'll hear it in the presentation, is 75 feet to the fire extinguishers. The maximum distance from back of the apartment, which is where it's measured under the fire code. So you're talking the very back, basically the furthest distance from that apartment to the fire extinguisher, even downstairs, is 62 feet, well below the 75 feet. As we said, it doesn't apply because it was prior to the enaction of the fire code provision, but still, they're still below. So, as I said, in filing the request for an exception or variance, we think you have the ability to allow Mr. Tucker, like I said, to continue operating as that property's been operating for 38 years. Beyond that, I think it is important to point out the constitutionality of a retroactive application. As I said, we're not talking about just the fire extinguishers going forward, but here we are. The Constitution requires that there be no retroactive application of statutes or codes. Why? Because people have a vested right in their property. They have a vested right to know how they operate that property, and you can't go change the game later on down the road. And that's the reason for grandfathering. And as Mr. Tucker pointed out, it's not just a sign ordinance. There's several variations of grandfathering in the building code, in the fire code, that apply. And that needs to be adhered by the city officials. Article 1, Section 16 basically says no retroactive laws shall be applied. And I'm going to go one step further and give you a case. It's called Robinson versus Crown Cork and Seal out of the Texas Supreme Court in 2010. And I want to read some of the language in there because I think it's important, as I said, not just here, but going forward, for you to understand why we believe this is such a big issue. As I said, not just for Mr. Tucker, but for other buildings in the city of Longview. There exists in this country a presumption against retroactive legislation that is deeply rooted in our jurisprudence and embodies a legal doctrine centuries older than our republic. The principle that the legal effect of conduct should ordinarily be assessed under the law that existed when the conduct took place has timeless and universal human appeal. Going forward, constitutional provisions limiting retroactive legislation must therefore be applied to achieve their intended objectives, protecting settled expectations and preventing abuse of legislative power. And we believe that's what has happened here. As I said, he's a good owner. Mr. Tucker has not done anything on this property that has required building inspectors to stay on top of him to make sure that he's fixing problems, because he doesn't have any problems. Over the last 38 years, whoever inspected this property under the fire code has determined that they did not need additional fire extinguishers until this year. And that tells me that there's a problem with looking at that interpretation of the fire code. Because if the prior fire marshal, well, even the same fire marshal over the last couple of years since the last inspection, has not interpreted the code this way. For some reason, in 2018, they've decided to change that interpretation and apply it to Mr. Tucker. So we think you should take that to heart and make sure that that the city officials adhere to the ordinances that they're tasked with applying, and make sure that they don't overstep those boundaries. Thank you.
I guess let's hold our questions until we hear staff comment. So like we had discussed, let's open the public comment up to Mr. Carter, if you'd like to come forward.
Morning.
Morning.
Morning. We'll have to start coming with a smaller lectern like our firing Governor Greg Abbott. You're good.
Want to give him a microphone?
Good morning. My name is Ken Carter, and I come before you today to speak on behalf of the over 53 million people that live in the United States alone with a disability. Out of those 53 million, the highest percentage have some form of mobility limitation. I find it appalling that a landlord would not only want to provide fire safety, that he would not want to provide fire safety to all tenants of his or her properties. Not only is this unsafe, but it opens up one to added liability. We live in an increasingly litigious society, and by not wanting to offer fire extinguishers or some type of fire suppression on all levels of a multi-story building is baffling to me. As you can see, I'm paralyzed, and I'm unable to navigate stairs. Therefore, if fire extinguishers are only located on the second floor, I wouldn't be afforded the opportunity to save the life of another, much less of my own. It is the duty of city government to protect all citizens, regardless of their economic status, disability, age, or race. The fire code isn't designed to add added tape, added unneeded apparatuses at a location, but to protect other people. I implore you to listen to and to take the advice of our highly skilled and trained Longview Fire Marshal. I'd hate to read of a preventable fire death at this complex due to someone that wanted to skirt the fire code. Thank you.
Thank you. You want to wait till the end? I guess now at this time, do we want to open it up to staff comment?
My name's Kevin May. I'm the fire marshal for the city of Longview. Under normal circumstances, Mark Savasta, who is the fire code official, would be here talking with y'all, but he is not available, so I'm going to act on behalf of the city, representing the fire marshal's office and also representing Mark as the fire code official. My goal in this is to plead our side of it, that we're just trying to do our due diligence to protect life and property in that order. When I took the oath of the fire marshal, I take it seriously, and that's what I'm here to do, is to protect life and property in that order. So Mr. Tucker brought up a lot of the stuff that I actually put into this PowerPoint presentation. So Chapter 1 does give the scope and authority. Chapter 9 does talk about fire extinguishers. Chapter 11 talks about existing properties. And then we're also going to talk about Chapter 10 in the National Fire Protection Association. It also deals with fire extinguishers, specifically placement of those fire extinguishers. .1 says this code is going to talk about the minimum requirements to offer reasonable level of life safety in new and existing buildings. New and existing buildings. Mr. Tucker did a very good job of presenting 102. I'm going to do it myself. Structures, facilities, and conditions arising after the adoption of this code. Existing structures, facilities, and conditions not legally in existence at the time of the adoption of this code. Existing structures, facilities, and conditions when required in Chapter 11, and we'll talk about Chapter 11 a little bit further on into the presentation. And then existing structures, facilities, and conditions which, in the opinion of the fire code official, constitutes a distinct hazard to life and property. I would offer to you that somebody that's got some mobility issues, there's a distinct hazard that they cannot go up a flight of stairs to get a fire extinguisher. So, through the course, Mr. Tucker told y'all that he wrote me a letter, I wrote him a letter, he wrote me a letter, we had a meeting together. He asked, well, which one are we following, 2012 IFC, or are we following the NFPA? Chapter 80 of the International Fire Code gives what reference material we can follow. And in this, you should have all that in your packet there. In Chapter 80, it tells you that NFPA is one of the references that we can go to for interpretation of the code. Specifically NFPA 10, which is going to talk about the portable fire extinguishers. So 104.1, the fire code official is hereby authorized to enforce the provisions of this code and shall have the authority to render interpretations of this code and to adopt policies, procedures, rules, and regulations in order to clarify the application of its provisions. Such interpretations, policies, procedures, rules, and regulations shall be in compliance with the intent and purpose of this code and shall not have the effect of waiving requirements specifically provided for this code. The intent of the code is to protect life and property in that order. So, talk about Chapter 9. We're going to get now kind of into the meat and the potatoes of why we're here. Chapter 9 deals with portable fire extinguishers. 906.1, where required, portable fire extinguishers shall be installed in the following locations: in new and existing, and a group R2 is where we get into the apartment complexes. There are some exceptions. One of the exceptions is you don't have to follow this specific code to the letter if you put fire extinguishers in each individual apartment complex. And that is something that we offered to Mr. Tucker when we had the meeting. Portable fire extinguishers shall be selected, installed, and maintained in accordance with this section and NFPA 10. We go back to Chapter 80. I mentioned it before. Chapter 80 is now sending us to NFPA 10 when we talk about fire extinguishers. The size and the distribution of the fire extinguishers. So, fire extinguishers have a rating. They're rating on the amount of coverage that they can get. So like a ordinary hazard, which is what we would be talking about on this, you want a 2A fire extinguisher. A 2A fire basically puts out twice as much as a 1A fire. So if you look under ordinary hazard, the minimum rated single extinguisher is a 2A. The maximum floor area per unit of A is 1,500 square feet. So we can actually say one fire extinguisher can cover 3,000 square feet. Doesn't mean it's going to put out a 3,000 square foot fire. It just means that that's the size extinguisher that you can cover for that level of A. The maximum floor area for the extinguisher, 11,250 square feet. We're getting off into other types of occupancies, but I've got it highlighted there, and we're going to move to level B here in just a minute. And then the maximum travel distance to the extinguisher is 75 feet. So that letter B that was under our maximum floor area for extinguisher, it's sending us to NFPA 10, the annex. And I have to go to this particular annex to get to the next annex. So just bear with me just a little bit as I try to get through this. So conspicuous locations. We're in the International Fire Code 12 right here. Portable fire extinguishers shall be located in a conspicuous location where they will be readily accessible and immediately available for use. These locations shall be along normal paths of travel unless the fire code official determines that the hazard posed indicates the need for placement away from normal paths of travel. Once again, I go back to what Mr. Carter said. I don't think that we can agree that somebody that's got a mobility issue should have to go upstairs to get a fire extinguisher. That's not his normal path of travel if he lives downstairs. They shall not be obstructed or obscured from view. If the fire extinguisher is upstairs and I live downstairs, I can't see it. The minimum number of extinguishers for each floor of a building shall be determined by dividing the total floor area by the maximum area to be protected per extinguisher. And in your packet there, you should have a chart that'll tell you all this. Each floor, doesn't matter how big, how small, each floor has to be protected by that fire extinguisher. This is that first annex that we talked about. It's going to tell you how to calculate your floor area and how many fire extinguishers will need on that floor. It's going to talk about the 75-foot travel distance. We've already discussed some of that. But as we go through, extinguisher quantities must be determined on a floor-by-floor basis. Table E.3.6 should not be used for determining extinguisher quantities based on the total footage of all floors in a multi-story building. So we have to have fire extinguishers accessible on each level of that floor. 1-story, 2-story, 5-story. We got to have the extinguishers there for people to be able to access them. So we offered a formal interpretation from NFPA 10 to Mr. Tucker. Does NFPA 10 prohibit the inclusion of a flight of stairs in the calculation of travel distance? Yes. Travel distance is intended to reflect the time it takes to respond. A staircase slows down response time. Furthermore, there could be interference to obtaining and transporting the extinguisher. Extinguishers shall be conspicuously located where they will be readily accessible and immediately available in the event of a fire. Fire extinguishers shall not be obstructed or obscured from view. Extinguishers located on another floor do not meet the intent of the paragraph. Chapter 11. Chapter 11 talks about existing buildings. The intent. The intent of this chapter is to provide a minimum degree of fire and life safety. We didn't ask him to put a sprinkler system in. We didn't ask him to put a fire alarm system in. We're asking him to provide the minimum amount of fire protection for the people that live on the lower floors of his apartment complex. And the minimum that we have would be a fire extinguisher. Fire safety requirements for existing buildings. There's a handout that talks about the fire suppression systems, the alarm systems. But I think the key here, this chapter shall not be construed to allow the elimination of fire protection systems or a reduction in the level of fire safety provided in buildings constructed in accordance with previously adopted codes. Now, the first code that we could actually find that the City of Longview adopted was the 1979 Southern Fire Code. It was adopted in 1981. Up until then, there was no fire code in the City of Longview. So, minimum requirements of fire extinguisher, life safety. Everybody has to have it. New buildings, existing buildings. Any questions?
I got a question. You said, and he's been having inspections every year, all years, all the way up to the 2017. What sparked the idea of the change in 2018 compared to all of his other past inspections?
I cannot tell you why it's been missed. So for my office as a fire marshal, I have deputy fire marshals that work up under me.
Now, you say it's been missed. You're saying he's doing something illegal that's not?
For some reason or another, I can't explain it. It was not brought to the attention that, hey, he didn't have fire extinguishers on the lower level.
Okay, but you see, this is what the problem now comes in at. If you keep on doing the same inspection every single year, and we rely on the fire marshal to do the inspection according to the code, and suddenly after 47 years, there's a specific change on the existing building that's been the same way for the last X amount of years, and the explanation is that they missed it, then that means that whoever done the inspection for the last X amount of years did not do the job. But you're expecting the owner of the property suddenly to change because you guys missed the opportunity to do the changes, which in my opinion, 5 years ago when he bought the property, he bought it in good faith that it's up to standard because it had the inspections being done on it. So how far back is the fire marshal going to penalize people to get buildings up to code?
I don't feel like I'm penalizing people. I feel like I'm trying to save lives.
We agree on that.
I can't speak for the interpretation of the code. I became the fire marshal last July, so I can't speak on behalf of the other fire marshal what his interpretation was. Don't know that it was ever even brought to his attention. I know this year we identified 4 apartment complexes, and this particular fire marshal, deputy fire marshal, identified 4 apartment complexes that didn't have extinguishers on the bottom floor. The other 3 have already come into compliance.
So how many fire extinguishers are you expecting?
It would be based off of either if he wanted to provide a single 2A fire extinguisher to be used by, typically in his apartment complex, he has 2 upstairs, 2 downstairs. So he would have one that could be used by both, or he could buy a smaller fire extinguisher and put it in each one, each of the bottom stairs apartment.
So are you planning on now to go to every multi-story apartment complex in Longview, Texas, and go through this same procedure to, on existing apartment complexes to enforce in the same situation where you've already had, it's been passed for all these years, and now we're going to go back to each one of those and see if, make sure they're all been passed the same way?
Yes.
Is the problem that they're not on the first floor? There's none on the first floor at all.
No, sir.
So if they were on the first floor instead of the second floor, would it comply?
No, because the code specifically says they have to be on each floor.
But the
Is-
the
is-
official code was only accepted in 1981. The building was built in 1980,
Yes.
and he passed all existing codes before 1981. And after 1981, every single time he passed the existing inspections. 5 years ago when he bought the building, he passed the inspections before he took the building over.
Actually, I don't know that we can say that's true because we cannot find that when he bought the building I thought it was 3 years ago, 5 years ago,
I thought-
whenever it was, we cannot find that he ever applied for a CO and actually had an inspection done.
Okay, but if you buy an apartment building, you don't need to have to apply for a new CO, it's just a transfer of title.
You're required to get a CO with the ownership change.
Okay, so he got his.
Because the certificate of occupancy
Yeah, I
is
got
in
it.
the name of the owner and it's for the occupant.
But that CO does not include inspecting every single apartment to make sure that it's in a living condition.
We don't go inside every apartment, but we do a general life safety and building inspection, so it would include that.
Yeah. So he passed. So what's the question that we need to answer exact today? What do we want to know if we're going to pass that where he can grandfather this in? Is that where we're at? Is that
I think the
question?
action item that we're supposed to be considering today is to either to say whether or not, yes, we agree with the interpretation of the fire marshal's office, or no, we don't. Is that correct?
Correct. He's appealed the interpretation of the fire code official, so basically what you're being asked to do is to uphold that interpretation or to say, no, that's the wrong interpretation.
Can I add something to that? As I said, in the last page of your packet is what was, the last page of the packet is actually what was submitted to appeal this to your board. And that's where the different exception and variance may also apply. So it's not just a matter of the
Actually,
straight.
the application only states that it's for an interpretation.
No, it also does request a variance.
I've got the
Alternative
application
request for
right
variance to the city, if you look at the bottom of the page.
I'm
It's
just
the very
looking.
last page in the packet.
here. Looking at the application. that
This was submitted with it.
The application that was submitted, maybe it may have been in the narrative, but the actual application that we used did not ask for that, so.
Okay, well, it was attached to the application requesting the variance and the exception.
Okay,
As,
guys.
as an alternative to the
The request.
discounting the interpretation of the fire code.
Yeah, there's two different items on the application. One talks about an appeal of an interpretation, and then the next one is the variance. So the interpretation is filled out, the variance is not.
And that's, it was attached on the second page,
Yeah.
the narrative.
Okay.
And I'm not sure why, but it's the last page in your packet.
May I do it?
I'm not sure of the procedure, but as you said, we do have a letter from the city of Longview. I'm not sure why the city doesn't have it, that they were considered legally conforming when he purchased the property. Obviously, he needed that for insurance and mortgage purposes. And so Mr. Ryan Peel, or Ryan Petrie, I believe, with the city of Longview confirmed that the property was legally conforming.
Okay, so I think we all agree it's a safety issue. You need the fire extinguisher. There is no argument about that. The point is not that. The point is, do we comply with a grandfather rule or not?
And that's our point, is that we feel it does. I mean, I will say, obviously, Mr. Tucker is concerned about safety. If that's an issue, we'll deal with that after this hearing, but the issue here is whether or not he's grandfathered and whether or not the board understands what the city officials are doing, because we do feel like they're going to go beyond this, and he is grandfathered and should be for any other item that the fire code now decides to interpret differently than they have for the last 38 years.
Can I ask the owner if he's got any letters of any of the homeowners in any written form over the last years that he's owned the building that complained in any way, shape, or form that they had a safety issue or a safety problem?
No, sir, I do not. I don't have any complaints, mobility issues or not. I'm guided and controlled by the ADA. And if I have someone who needs a fire extinguisher outside their door and they have a mobility issue, I will install it. The issue here today is whether I'm grandfathered. We have the power to rewrite the code. I will tell you what I do have. I'm happy to give this to you. I have page after page of testimonials from my happy tenants. I guess it comes down to this. It's black or white. Either the code says what the code says, and 102.1.1 says that existing buildings are exempt. Or the code doesn't say what the code says, and it says whatever they want it to say. Their way is going to cost a lot of people a lot of money. That's all there is to it. It's going to damage property values in Longview. Shouldn't be allowed to happen. If they see a distinct risk, I'll take care of it. My property is inspected 4 times a year. My mortgage company inspects it. My insurance company, particularly the liability company, inspects it. The city code marshal, whoever comes and inspects it, and the pool person comes and inspects it. They were there today. We pass, no problems. I'll be happy to get you the letters from the mortgage company. Everything's fine. I don't run my property the way the other properties are run. And I don't appreciate being treated like that. I run a good property. My people are happy living there. I take care of my place. If I thought there was a great risk, I would take care of it. The fire extinguishers are not that big a deal. This is just the first step for them. They're going to go into the rest of the code. And let me conclude with this. Y'all saw this just recently from Dollar General, and we got a copy of that from them with an open records request. The Dollar General engineer, I guess it was, in his comment, he said, we don't want all those fire extinguishers all over the building because it would encourage our employees to try to fight the fire instead of saving their lives by fleeing the building. I'm all in favor of safety. But I'd rather my building burn down than somebody die trying to fight a fire.
We need to talk.
Should we deliberate?
Yeah, I think so.
I think so too.
If I may add something to that, when we had our meeting, Mr. Tucker came in with his, I believe it's Travis, is that right, Travis? And we were discussing the stuff. Mr. Tucker told us, and I can't quote it because I didn't record it, he told us that if he felt like one single person in his apartment complex would use a fire extinguisher, he would not have a problem purchasing them.
You see, this is where my problem comes in. And this is just, again, this is my viewpoint, is if any person in that building at any stage in the last 30 years wrote a letter saying that they have a problem and they feel unsafe, that would give something to say it's an unsafe condition. There's no record of that. The inspections was done for how many years, and still there was no problem with that. We have a new city inspector, we have a new city marshal. Now we're going back and changing things. And for me, it's a safety issue. I agree with you 100%. it needs a fire extinguisher. I personally think you need a fire extinguisher in every single room in the building for safety's sake. But that's not the point. That is not the point here. My problem is if you start going down this road right now and you start saying the grandfather clause does not exist. In other words, existing buildings in Longview does not have a grandfather clause on this. I'm worried about what else is going to change. I'm really worried about what else is going to change. Because if you don't say that the grandfather clause does not exist, that means there's a lot of buildings in the south of Longview that's going to have a problem. So that's just my opinion.
Well,
We
I
can
mean,
deliberate.
The code talks about conditions and operations arising after the adoption of the code and existing conditions and operations. So, I mean, this would apply.
Oh,
An existing
absolutely.
building would apply.
It's addressing the
Absolutely.
issue of grandfathering.
But
So,
it's
right,
still
so-
a safety issue. You need a fire extinguisher. But my point is just how far is this going to go?
Well, I mean, all existing buildings are going to be under this code to some extent. It's just, I guess we're looking at the interpretation of an existing building under this code, not the fact that it doesn't fall under it, correct?
I don't guess I understand quite your question.
So, I mean, I hear that he's saying he's shouldn't be grandfathered under the code. Well, he is. I mean, all buildings are, to some extent.
I should be, yes. Yeah, and I think to answer the question I think you may be answering, grandfathering is not universal over a code. There's bits and pieces, and the code will be specific to say this is applicable to existing and new construction, or this is only applicable to new construction. So that term grandfathering or existing non-conforming, you don't just get to use that as a blanket to the code. And I think the question here is, under this circumstance, does the code give the fire code official the authority to say that that section of the code is applicable on an existing facility?
Okay.
And then the other question is, if you feel that it is, great. And if you feel that in this situation, though, they shouldn't have to put hydrant or put extinguishers, that's a different question. It was not on their application. It was just a statement in their subsequent letter. So that could be a separate request down the road. It's not something that we're considering today, though, but that is a different question.
You want to make that motion? You want to make that motion on the existing, on what you were talking about?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm probably making a mistake. When I get an inspection from one of my insurance inspectors, get the report, or when I get it from the mortgage company, it typically comes back with something, although lately they may come back clear, but normally they say, here are some recommendations or here are some requirements. I don't have a problem with them making a recommendation so that I can, as a business owner, make a decision. That's not what they're doing, gentlemen. They're misinterpreting the code and they're forcing me to do something, be all in the name of life and property or health and safety. Well, how about this? How many lives would be saved in Longview if we reduced the speed limit to 5 miles an hour for the entire city? Isn't it life and safety the most important thing? Wait, no smoking in the entire city of Longview, even in your own home. Isn't life and safety the most important thing? We can take it to extremes. It's my opinion. The authors of the code took into consideration my rights as an existing building owner and limited their power in number 4 of section 102. And that's what you should back up. I'm not questioning their motives. Nobody wants somebody to get hurt. But I'm questioning whether they can go back 40 years and change the past.
I'd like to follow up on that if I could.
Dennis?
I think we need to close the discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Dennis Williams in the building inspection. And just to follow up, or maybe to help clarify something, we were previously under the 2003 IFC, the International Fire Code. When we went to the 2012 in 906.1, they added the word existing for new and existing buildings, where previously that was not in there. So to say that it was missed all this time maybe was not a valid point, but I believe the code has corrected itself over the years by adding this.
And jog my memory, when did we adopt the 2012 fire code?
2015, 2016.
Yeah.
15. It's 2015.
So there may have been one or two inspections that possibly that could have been missed. Thank you.
And I bought the property in August of 2014. So if the code was adopted in 15, am I grandfathered?
Motion to close public comment?
Yeah.
You can do that.
Yeah.
You can do
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and close public comment at this point. Do we have any discussion that we want to have amongst ourselves?
Yes.
And we can't, it has to be in public.
All in public.
Yeah, so. Do you have any discussion y'all like to have?
I'll second your motion if you want to what you were talking about.
Yeah, but I'm worried about that. My biggest concern is not the fact it's a safety issue. There's absolutely no argument about it. It's a safety issue. You have to have a fire extinguisher. There's no if, buts, whys, or whens about it. My problem does not come in with a safety issue. My problem comes in with the point of having had the inspections done for a certain amount of years and then suddenly changing it.
Yeah,
But we're not
I'm
here
for
to
the motion.
decide.
No, I know that, but it's about the interpretation. My question is, do they have the right to interpret the law right now to change it, what has been done for the last couple of years?
Unfortunately, I think that's a little bit bigger issue
I know.
than what we're deciding.
I know.
Here today.
My problem is that it's coming down, it will go, what we decide here is going to lead to something else.
Well, if they, what happens in here, if it gets that big, they go to the council, and all this moves to the main council. So if they don't accept our recommendation.
Whatever action is here today is final. It does not go to the council.
It would be a variance, if the variance comes back before us and we voted against it or for it, whatever it is, then it would then go to council for them to consider.
Incorrect. Any action of this board is final as it
Okay.
relates to interpretations of the code official or any request for waivers or variances. Any action before this board is final. The only recommending authority the board has would be relating to new codes. Then this board would make a recommendation to city council.
I was referring back to the deal with the veterinarians with the fire.
Correct, and that was a code change. So this board makes recommendations when it comes to code changes. But as far as interpretations of the code, which is what we're looking at today, then that action would be final with this board.
And, my question is, like what Dennis had said, in 2003, it said proposed buildings or new construction, and then the 2012 code, it went from that to throwing in existing buildings. My thought is the people who write the code are smarter than us, in theory. There's a reason why they saw an imminent hazard to life safety. Like what Mr. Carter said, you have somebody that's disabled on the bottom floor. He can't physically get to the second floor to get an extinguisher. At some point between the 2003 and the 2012 code, someone's identified that and they've brought that up as a distinct possibility. And I'm not getting into their train of thought, but that may be one of the reasons why now they're throwing the existing buildings into, Chapter 906, or Chapter 9, covering the fire extinguishers. So I don't see that being necessarily an interpretation. I mean, the code is the code.
What section is this? What, is this the NFPA? Because this is the IFC. What is this? It wasn't a starting page on it.
Yeah,
Because this E2 arrangement of the building has it be determined on
is
a
that the
4x4
Appendix
basis.
E of the NFPA
What is it that you're referring to?
that talks about the fire extinguishers?
The-
Annex, I'm sorry,
annex.
Annex E.
It's
Yeah.
behind the IFC. It says 2018 edition at the bottom, E2, E.2, section is what I'm looking at, be determined on a 4x4 basis.
That's going to be Annex C of the NFPA.
NFPA 10.
Yes.
Man. And that's what the IFC references? Yeah.
Chapter 80 of the IFC is what gives us the opportunity to use NFPA as a reference material. In this specific case, NFPA 10 is what gives us direction on the fire extinguishers. Like I said, not only the travel distance and the type, but also that it is based off of a floor by floor.
And the code change between 12 stipulated and existing buildings.
Yeah, we've got 2003, it said all buildings, and somewhere in there, they changed it to new and existing.
And you don't have a date on that, when that change was made.
I've got a copy of the 2003 code, it says all buildings, and then we went from 2003 to the 2012 code, and in 2012, they changed the verbiage to new and existing.
But the 2012 code was only taken in on 2015.
In 2015, the city adopted the
So
2012
the first
code.
inspection that would have fallen under the new code was 2016, January of 2016.
Most
For his property.
Most likely,
So,
I don't have that copy, I don't have that information readily available, but yes.
so is the reason also that we're here now is because the fire inspector found a distinct danger in this building, and that's the reason why we're here today?
We go out and we do inspections on commercial properties. The inspector went out we do apartment complexes in January and February, typically. The inspector said, there's no fire extinguishers on the lower floor, we got to get that corrected. And wrote it up and sent it in, and as he did 3 other apartment complexes. And the other 3 said, okay, and they got it taken care of. I've got those completed inspections. I mean, like I said, I don't know why it wasn't caught the year before. I can't answer for that, but it was caught this year.
Can I speak again? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Real quick, on that property, are there fireplaces or barbecue pits or anything like that?
Every unit has a fireplace, yes, sir.
Wood burning or gas?
Wood burning.
Wood burning, okay.
I guess let's talk about the timing a little bit. I bought the property in August of 2014. Here's a copy of my inspection from Thursday, March 10th of 2016. If the 2012 code was adopted, the 2012 code was adopted in 2015, why isn't the violation on my 2016 report? I passed.
If I might, we've all worked with the city here. When they adopt a new code, it takes them a long time to go through the whole code, learn it, and then apply it in the field. And I see stuff that may take sometimes a year for us to, or more, to get worked out. And so it may take an inspection or 2 before something's noticed like that. I know in my industry that it's something I deal with is interpretation of codes and stuff that may have been adopted in 2015 may now, have been overlooked in 16 and then in 17 applied. So, I mean, you're not being isolated out on that account.
Okay. But if I bought the property in 14 and the new code wasn't adopted by the city until 2015, and I have a letter dated 2014 that I am a legal non-conforming use,
Well,
why is it being retroactively applied to me whenever they bothered to read it?
Right.
And whenever they bothered to enforce it? Why is it being retroactively applied to me the year before the code was adopted?
I don't have an answer for that, but
I don't either.
I'm just sharing with you where my thoughts are at.
And I understand that, but I just don't think it's right.
If there was a recommendation to him from the city of Longview for the fire extinguishers, how many fire extinguishers are we talking about? How many floors do you have?
We were talking 38 in new individual extinguishers.
On the first floor?
All on the first floors, yes. So I'd have to have one per, what? Well, yeah, the extinguishers in the boxes. But we have 38 individual stairwells scattered in 11 buildings, front and back of the buildings. It's kind of hard to explain. I can show you a site plan.
No, that's good. I'm with you. I got a motion they want to try?
I'm not motioning.
I'll make a motion.
You will?
Let me make one remark before we motion this. I'm having a very hard time with this, just because of the fact I can see where this is going. But I fully support the city of Longview, because we actually deferred to them on the Dollar General that you referred to before. I understand your concerns about the grandfathering. I completely understand the cost that's going to go along with it. I completely understand that. But the fact is, the safety is still there. For me, I agree with safety and life, but I absolutely understand where you're coming from. Absolutely. But safety still trumps that for me. So I'll make the motion of the city has the right to interpret it this way.
Second that motion.
Any more discussion? All right, we have a first by Nico and a second. So all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. All right, since we've already handled public comment, the next item would be adjournment. So at this point, we will adjourn the meeting.